Hello, today is Tuesday, September 11th, 2018. I'm Joe Schmidt with TC2, and this is Staying Connected. Today's podcast is a continuation of our educational series, Staying Ahead of the Demand for Network Cost Savings. In these podcasts, we've been revealing useful strategies to help enterprises achieve continuous network cost improvement and deliver world-class network infrastructure. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Theresa Knutson, a project director at TC2, and Steve Rosen, a partner at LB3. The three of us are going to be discussing best practices for how enterprises buy telecom expense management solutions. Thanks, guys, for joining me. And Theresa, let's start with you. Can you tell us why telecom expense management, or TEM, is needed in the enterprise?
Sure, and thanks, Joe. As we've been discussing over the course of this past week, TEM is a very valuable tool as it touches all aspects of your telecommunications lifecycle. And the interesting factor and trend that we're seeing is that traditionally TEM meant telecommunications expense management, but it's really morphing into more than that, almost to a technology expense management service where these suppliers can cover not only telecommunications, but they can encompass services like technology, managed services, maintenance, hosting, and cloud services. And the vast majority of our clients use some type of externally provided TEM service. So buying TEM services should be approached in the same way you purchase other technology services. You have to do some market research, you need to understand the industry, and then ultimately competitively source the services in order to get the best deal.
Okay, Steve, what should a company do if they do want to competitively source TEM services, either for the first time or to reassess their current TEM service provider?
Good question, Joe. So the first thing that you need to do is to determine what services you want in scope. Do you want wireline, wireless, technology services, managed services, a combination? And then you need to determine some basic metrics about your spend. What's the annual spend by the type of service? What are the number of invoices processed per month, both paper and electronic? What are the number of vendor payments a month? What are the number of suppliers? And what are the number of inventory items you want to track? If you're assessing the market for global services, then you also have to capture these metrics by region. And if you have an incumbent TEM provider, you'll be ahead of the game. You should be able to capture most of this information directly from them. If you don't have an incumbent TEM, then you've got a little bit of a research project on your hands.
All right, so after a company gathers this information, what's next?
Well, I suggest that you learn about the market for TEM services. And it's an ever-evolving marketplace, especially in light of acquisitions and changes in the TEM industry, both in the wireless technology and wireless spend areas. And so for those who have been in this space for a while, you've seen kind of the rise and the fall of Tango and the reemergence of Tango and the rise of other suppliers. I attended a recent market event where the analysts are predicting even more consolidation in this industry as companies look to close gaps in their service offerings. So, for example, this past year, MDSL and Telesoft combined to emerge under a single combined brand called MDSL. That primarily happened for that company to provide services globally. Calero bought a company called A&B Group in Europe to expand their global presence. And you also see very stable and consistently growing companies like CAS continue to expand their regional partnerships to deliver a more consistent TEM service globally. So use market research to determine which companies might best suit your requirements.
Right, Theresa. And we also find that it's much more efficient to pre-vet a select group of TEM providers that can serve your enterprise needs rather than to sort of issue an RFP to the world and have to review responses from providers that could never do the job in the first place, either based on geographic footprint, capabilities, reputation, or other factors. So prior to issuing the RFP, you can spend a few days holding vendor meetings with a group of, say, 6 to 8, 10 companies, and then objectively rank them in terms of ability to meet your requirements. Then you use these vendor sessions to learn more about the specific services that the vendors can provide. It could be invoice receipt, processing, payment and auditing, dispute management, provisioning and inventory management, et cetera, as well as contract management functions. The education you get during these sessions will certainly help you craft your RFP for the specific services you want to buy.
Yeah, and I agree with that approach. I think these kind of pre-vetting sessions are invaluable, especially if you're new to the TEM world, but they're also very educational for you if you are kind of an old hand in this world, because the TEM services, as I mentioned, are evolving and emerging very quickly. And you will be surprised to learn the TEM vendors' capabilities around integrations with products like ServiceNow and into your CMDB. Also, on the wireless front, the capabilities are expanding tremendously as well. So I suggest using these sessions with the vendors to understand, one, not only the services they offer, but how they offer them, because that comes in many flavors too. You can go from a full business process outsourcing model where you do nothing and the supplier does everything for you, to a software as a service model where you're buying their software, but your employees are using it, and lots of flavors in between. So many clients use the word TEM to describe how they specifically purchase services, but keep in mind that there's a wide range of possibilities out there for you. So understand the capabilities that are offered and then decide what you want and need and are willing to pay for. And that's a kind of a vital part of these pre-RFP vendor meetings. And I think the absolute best benefit of these sessions is it allows you to narrow the field of participants that you ultimately issue an RFP to potentially just maybe 3 or 4 very viable candidates. The narrowing of the field allows you to spend more time vetting the best candidates during the RFP process, which will allow you to get the best vendor selection, ultimately the best service.
You know, that's really great advice, because we all know how long it takes to evaluate and rank these proposals. So that really is really great insight. All right. So Steve, do you have any other advice?
Yes, Joe. There's a few other things that will help you in your RFP crafting. You want to make sure to craft your RFP requirements to address all aspects of the required services, from the basic parameters your company needs for an overall MSA to the specifics that you need to address by region and service type, perhaps in the statements of work. We also strongly recommend that if you don't have a good RFP to use, you seek out assistance, because drafting an RFP for these particular services is a unique exercise. You'll want to put some contractual terms in the RFP as well, and those terms are going to be similar to those in many professional services contracts with a slight twist. So you want to make sure that you own the intellectual property that's produced by the TEM provider, which would include the reports and templates. You want to have the right to keep your data. You want to keep your information confidential. There should be mutual and fair indemnifications and limitations of liability. It's important to have full termination rights for material breach and chronic failure to meet SLAs, and partial termination rights by region, so that if the TEM provider is failing in one part of the world, you can just pull the plug on that without bringing down the whole house. And another thing that's important is transition periods to onboard any new service providers. In terms of software, you definitely want the right to use and copy any vendor software. So if you structure the RFP requirements by geographic region, if your provider is failing to provide in a particular region, you can just terminate those services in particular countries, or for particular services, have your charges reduced. And as I said before, rather than bring down the whole house of cards, you can move on and bid those regions to another provider.
Yeah, and I agree. I think from a business perspective, crafting your RFP requirements around, SLAs, savings guarantees, and rights to audit behind your TEM provider by region is really important. Interesting trend is that historically people would buy TEM services in one region from one company and other TEM services from another company in another region. And that's really changing. People are looking kind of for one supplier to meet all those needs. So crafting the RFP with requirements by region is critical. And as Steve mentioned, having the contractual rights to terminate partially the contract if they're failing in one region is great. So, make sure that you have meaningful SLAs and that you get credits for marginally bad services, and ultimately if they're failing horribly across either all regions or holistically, that you have the right to terminate.
And how long does this process typically take?
Well, like any thorough RFP, the process from end to end can take a while. I suggest 6 to 9 months of planning from the initial steps to contract execution. But if you have a really complex environment with multiple service types and scope in multiple regions of the world, it could take a bit longer.
Yeah, Theresa, I couldn't agree more. Allowing adequate time for contract negotiations is so important, because as everyone knows, the closer you are to a service end date by your incumbent TEM provider, the more pressure you're under to disclose the deal, and the more likely you are to concede to subpar terms on things like limitations of liability, indemnities, SLAs, etc. So you need to allow sufficient time to engage in meaningful negotiations on the terms and conditions, because your leverage is just going to decrease as it gets closer and closer to service termination. What can really help you there, too, is if you build some transition periods into your last contract, then you can use this as a way to continue getting service from your incumbent provider while you negotiate with a new provider and sort of take the pressure off of not having any service at all.
Okay, good stuff. Thanks, Steve. So, Theresa, do you have any closing thoughts?
My basic advice here is that sometimes change is a good thing, and sometimes change can be a really, really good thing. So if you're unhappy with your current provider, step back and assess whether or not you can fix it, because fixing a relationship is easier than moving suppliers. But if it's at the point where you're not happy with the services you're getting, your inventory is bad, and you just feel like you're not getting what you're paying for, absolutely go through this process and take your services out to market. But if you're in a situation where you are happy with your TEM provider, hang on to that relationship because it is a rare thing. So if you've got a good one, continue to kind of manage and monitor them like you have been. You can benchmark the services to make sure you're paying correctly for them. But if you have a great relationship, try to hang on to it.
Okay, thanks, Theresa. And again, Steve, thank you. And thank you guys for sharing this really important information. And these are great insights on buying TEM services. For our next podcast, and actually it's our final podcast in the Staying Connected series, I'll be joined by Laura McDonald from LB3 and Jack Deal from TC2, who will be talking with me about why it's important to use an advisor to support your ICT needs. So please look out for messages from us providing links to our latest podcasts, or simply go to our websites. And finally, if you, the listening audience, would like to learn more about best practices for ICT procurements, or if you'd like to discuss other ICT needs with Theresa, Steve, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues, please give us a call or shoot us an email. And you can also stay current by checking out our websites or follow us on LinkedIn.